Hi, I'm Jim. I have a small business, Two Rivers Paper Company, and I'm here at Jackson's in Dalston to talk about paper and answer any questions you might have. I started in the paper industry in 1963, so I've been making paper for over 50 years. I started unloading lorries in the mill that my father was managing at the time, and I worked in various mills around the country, gradually working my way up in production, technically trained in the 60s and 70s, and managed a conventional paper mill. And 30 odd years ago, I fancied doing something on my own. I'd been there for 10 years. So my wife and I, we bought a cottage in West Somerset with an old watermill attached. No water wheel at that time. Over about a year, we put the building back together, floored it out so that we could make paper in there, set up the loft for drying the paper, set up the basement area so we could do all the wet work. We didn't change the building, but adapted it so that we could produce paper in there. And I suppose about 1988, we started to produce watercolour paper using the name Two Rivers Paper. Two Rivers has actually been in existence since 1976. And I didn't acquire the name until 10 years after that. It was started by a chap called Bob Partridge, who was a paper mill engineer up at Ramsbottom in Lancashire, and it was carried on by a printmaker, Paul. And when he'd had enough, he heard that I was starting to make paper in Somerset, offered me the name, offered me the equipment that he had. Over the years, we've refined what we do. We're not a working museum. We're not trying to produce paper exactly in the way it was made 200 years ago. We're just trying to produce as good a product as we can with the limited resources that we have and the limited capacity of the equipment. The original water wheel had long gone from pit mill, but we found a second-hand wheel, installed that in the year 2000. And we use that to break up rag, particularly linen rag, so we can add that to the cotton that we use to make a stronger paper, a more workable sheet. Paper is always made from plant fibre, so it's cellulose actually. It has to be plant fibre. Wool is a different material entirely. Cellulose sticks to itself. It doesn't require any glues to bond it. It bonds naturally one fibre to the next fibre. So you start off with some material which is going to give you cellulose fibre. And the general rule is if it's long enough to spin, you can make paper out of it. So most of the world's paper is made from wood fibre. The lignin that holds the fibres together is chemically cooked out. We don't use any wood pulp, and we start off with a relatively pure, well actually a very pure fibre. Cotton and linen are pure cellulose. You need to mix that with water, it's always water, and pound it. So it requires some kind of beating, or in modern industrial parlance, it needs refining. That bruises the fibres, shortens them actually, but it increases their surface area so they bond eventually together to make a stronger, more intimately married sheet. You then dilute it again, so you're keeping adding water as the process goes along. At the point that the paper's formed, it's in a slurry, a mix of about 99 parts water to 1 part of fibre. You add some chemicals. Case of watercolour paper, it's an acid-free size, generally known as aquapel, to resist attack by acids in the future, make the paper longer lasting. This thin stock, this thin mix, allows you to sieve out or filter out a sheet of paper. We make paper by hand, so we sieve out a rectangular sheet on a phosphor bronze mesh with a surround called a deckle. Deckle is German for lid, and it sits on the top like a lid does, except it's open like a picture frame. That allows a single sheet of paper to form evenly on the surface of the mould, as it's called. Deckle's removed. The mould is inverted with a wet sheet of paper and is pressed or couched, from coucher to lay, French. It's couched onto a woolen surface which will give the paper its eventual tooth. We press it in a hydraulic press. We usually press it twice, cold pressing, and then we air dry it. In our case, we use very little heat, just natural ambient air, over about 24 hours. We then dip the sheet in gelatin to surface size it, press it again, and then we hang the sheets up from racks in the mill to dry. Whole process takes about 3 days. That's hand paper making. It's how all paper was made up until 1800-ish. Machine-made papers, all the same processes take place, but they take place continuously, so the machine is making a ribbon of paper, very wide, meters wide in a big modern machine, very fast. But it's an endless belt through which, or in very modern machines, usually two, through which the aqueous suspension of pulp is sieved, dewatered, and then the water is sucked out using vacuum. It's pressed out using rolls and endless blankets, felts as they're called, and dried out over heated cylinders. Surface size, usually using starch rather than animal glue in modern paper making. Smoothed on calendars and cut up. But the process is always the same. You take a fibrous material, you extract the fibres, you treat them, you sieve out the water, you filter the fibres out into an endless mat on a machine or a small sheet by hand. You press it, you dry it, you surface coat it, you smooth it, and you sell it. Paper making came to England comparatively late, late Tudor times. Paper first started to be made in England, though it had been made in the Low Countries much further back than that. At that time, paper was always made by made from rags rather, rope, and old sailcloth, and the big change in the industry came in the invention of the paper machine. Both the Fidrinia and which is a conventional paper machine, and the mould machine, cylinder mould machine, which is used to make watercolour papers by my competitors, really. But we still do it the old way. Around about the turn of the 1800s, the mechanical paper making started in the UK and spread rapidly throughout the world. Paper machine would make as much in an hour as a shift of paper makers would make in a day, and a day wouldn't be 8 hours, it'd be much longer than that. So it made paper cheap because you could produce so much more quickly and with less manpower, less labour input. So it had a huge effect. Now, paper machines will produce tens, sometimes hundreds of tons of paper an hour, a single paper machine. It's a fact of life that all paper makers now, throughout the entire world, take the environment very, very seriously. We're On an industrial scale, use vast amounts of water. Actually, making paper by hand, we use very, very little. The industry has a reputation for polluting watercourses, and pretty much undeserved now, because pulping is much more environmentally friendly. How do we, as a tiny little organisation, what do we think we're contributing? Well, in global terms, absolutely nothing, because we only make a few tons a year. But we do use water power. We have our solar panels supplementing our electricity use. We're plastics free, so all our packaging is paper. We obviously have to be very careful about what we put to drain. Everything goes through a small septic tank system and is digested, and the water runs away to ground. We have a trout farm about a quarter of a mile downstream from us, so you can bet your bottom dollar if we put anything nasty into the water, the fish would be turning upright. And they don't. We've had no problems like that. Our raw materials are cotton and linen. We use no wood pulp at all, or very, very rarely. But none of that is recycled. We use cotton that's never been spun, but it's not a recycled item. It's virtually impossible on a commercial scale to get sufficient clean rag cuttings, because viscose is present in virtually everything, and we don't have all that many people who are producing that kind of material in this country anyway. The linen that we use is rag, so but sometimes we buy new linen on loom lengths and cut it up for the qualities it gives. Nothing to do with recycling and nothing to do with saving wood. With so few people practicing the craft in the UK, it looked as though, should I stop making paper, a quintessentially English tradition of making watercolour paper by hand would end. So about 4 years ago, I've started to think seriously about the business continuing beyond my time. We have had a small part of a big new arts development in Watchet, specifically designed and built so that we could make paper there. So Two Rivers Paper will be moving into East Quay, but it's still necessary to train up new young blood. I have two excellent young paper makers, Zoe and Kieran. Their training in both cases has been supported by Quest, which is the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust, and also by the Heritage Crafts Association. I'm very, very grateful. But I've been able to make them very competent paper makers, and they will be the future. I have recruited part-time at the moment, but I wish you could do even more hours. A very, very good administrator, artist and bookbinder, Sarah. Neil is still working for me. I don't feel critically endangered. I think there's little doubt that the business will continue beyond my time, and that gives me, actually it's one of the things I'm very, very pleased to have done. I mean, I like making paper and I like getting paid, but having reset for the future has been hard in all sorts of ways, personally and financially, and in the amount of work that it's simple amount of work that it's all involved. But I can see that I've set something up which will go on, and that's nice.